Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's pray together. Father in heaven, as we prepare to sing to you and praise to you, we recall all the wonderful things we have to celebrate, to praise you for, to glorify you for, your powerful acts of creation, bringing the world from nothing, your powerful acts of salvation, bringing us from nothing and death into a loving relationship with you. Our Father in heaven, as we think of the wonderful value of our closeness with you through Jesus Christ, let our hearts sing praise to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's rise together and sing. Last week we talked about two different approaches to the view of human speech and discourse and the way we should talk to each other. One that I represented with Plato, but you could think of lots of people in the modern world as well, thinks that we really shouldn't try to persuade each other. We should just offer each other demonstrations. I begin with a logical presumption, and I proceed through a series of deductions. And just like in a mathematical proof, you wouldn't expect the author of the mathematical proof to try to describe to you his character or the work he did or his background. He wouldn't use lively language. He would just operate on the principles of mathematical deduction. And sometimes people think of this in the modern world with science or other things. We should essentially adopt a mechanical approach to speech, where the movement that the speech causes in people is wholly caused by what logic or science or some other mechanical discipline requires. That's one view. Another view is that it's appropriate when we speak to each other for us to use persuasion. That is to say, to appeal not only to the intellect or whatever criterion of truth, mathematics, or science has developed, but for us to try to address the whole person, to move the person. So as you learned as 1Ls, traditionally there are three forms of ways that we think about when we try to persuade. One of them is logic. We don't abandon logic in persuasion. We make appeals to argument and the mind. But in addition, we consider other factors. We consider establishing the ethos or the credibility, the character of the speaker. And we treat persuasion as something that is attempting to move people's wills. And the movement of the will is associated with pathos or emotion or feeling. And so in our efforts to persuade people, we try to move their feelings. We try to have them sympathize with us and to empathize with them. We're concerned about the audience and how the audience will receive what we say. And in the course of doing that and developing that art and discipline, we learn many things. We learn various topics of persuasion. So for example, today, you can see Paul argues for one great theme, that we are saved, that we are related to God through faith in Christ alone, and not through works, not through an outward act like circumcision, a ritual, but through our faith and love of God. That's how we are justified before God. That's how we find ourselves satisfied and approved before God, not because of the works that we've done and that we can point to before God. And Paul comes at this argument through many different directions. He doesn't just try and attempt a logical demonstration of this thesis. He talks about who he is. He builds up his ethos. He talks about the source of the gospel in Revelation. He talks about how he didn't get the gospel from anybody else. Later on in Galatians, he's going to make some logical arguments. We're going to deal with one of those next week. He looks at the scriptures and he argues from the scriptures to this thesis. In particular, he looks at scriptures in the Old Testament and shows how the Old Testament teaches justification through faith in Jesus Christ rather than through reliance on our works. But a significant portion of Galatians is concerned with other questions. What's the source of the gospel? When you receive the gospel, what transformation did it make in you? What are the signs of the power of the gospel? He doesn't just, in this argument, find scriptures and reason from them. He talks about himself. He talks about the origins of the gospel, how it's not derived from those other authorities who are being set up falsely against him. He's involved in showing the credibility of the gospel as he gave it to the Galatians. He talks about how not only is it wrong, not only are the people he's opposing wrong, but how the claim that they're making would dishonor Christ. It would make ridiculous his sacrifice on the cross. He brings them into tension with Christ himself and say, you would make Christ's sacrifice on the cross meaningless, worthless. Did your Savior die for you? And you would say he didn't need to, that it was a foolish action. He addresses the arguments that are the position that's opposed to him from many, many, many different directions. So this is one of the things that we learn in rhetoric, in law, is that we may have one course that we think is the strongest argument, but for an audience, we can offer them many, many, many different kinds of arguments. The truth can be exposed from many, many, many different directions, and Paul uses all of those vehicles to do that, including showing the inner contradiction of those like Peter who would oppose him. We'll look at that argument intensively today. Rhetoric also considers the style of language. In science, the style of language doesn't matter. Read a scientific article, and they labor to appear unstyled. Actually, people have observed that scientific articles actually are very stylistic. They all follow very similar stylistic forms that signals to people that this is a scientific article. Instead of using a simple word, they use a fancy word. They use speech and arrangements that are tightly controlled. I think everybody uses style, but rhetoricians adopt it. And Paul uses lots of style. He calls people names. He damns people. He curses people. He does all sorts of very dramatic things. He uses metaphors. He uses analogies. His language is stylistically not bare, not scientific. And another element of rhetoric, when you're learning, for example, to write a brief or to make an argument, one of the things you learn is what we call arrangement. There's an order that things should go in. You need to pay attention to the order in which you present an argument. The introduction comes before the conclusion. The introduction comes before the argument. You should establish your credibility as a speaker before you argue your case. You should lay out the argument that you're going to make, the theme of your argument. You should engage people's interest in it and command their attention before you proceed to the argument. These are basic issues of rhetoric, and those who are anti-rhetoric suggest that we should suppress these considerations. And those who think that moving people is something we should engage in consciously and develop as an art say, no, we should pay a great deal of attention to these things and understand what it is we're doing in speaking. And so, for example, right now I'm introducing our topic by saying, look, there is a big debate in the world between different ways of approaching speech. What we're doing when we talk. Should we consciously be aware of the way in which we act to persuade people, or should we suppress that in the name of a superior kind of speech that is only deductive, that only a computer could understand, or something like this? And this is a topic which is important for you because a very basic way that people have understood the work of lawyers, and a way that I think is really true, is, as I said last week, lawyers are not just lawyers, we're attorneys. We don't just memorize the law. We don't just learn legal rules. We don't even only learn how to apply legal rules to facts. We also have to persuade. A basic thing we do is we persuade our clients. We try to move our clients to do the right thing. That we call that counseling. We give them advice. And if we think we know the right thing for our clients to do, then we want them to follow our advice. And if we want them to follow our advice, then if you believe that rhetoric is an appropriate form of human expression, you should be conscious of the ways that you can help your clients to follow your advice by persuading them. If you think that the problems that human beings experience in life is not only a lack of mental acuity and understanding, but also people get afraid. They become greedy. They are insufficiently concerned with justice. They are thinking in bad ways, and they need help to be summoned to the truth that is in their heart, the truth that they'll recognize if they are moved to recognize it. If you think that's true, then we want to consciously embrace the task that we're undertaking as lawyers, not only to learn the law, we certainly do learn the law. It's a great source of topics of argumentation. But we also want to learn about persuasion. And of course, we are committed in this law school to teaching you not only rules of law in a scientific manner, but also to persuade. The most basic way you do that is in your important legal research and writing classes, where you practice the written form of persuasion. But not just in that, in things like contract drafting. You're actually engaged in another kind of rhetoric. In the medieval world, this was self-consciously called the School of Rhetoric, the way in which you draft a contract so that it will persuade the parties in the future or a judge in the future about what the order of the relationship should be. You have a wonderful teacher of that in Professor Purnell. We're committed to this because this is the common law tradition of understanding law. Law is not predominantly a science. Law is something which arises out of the rhetorical debates of parties that are opposed to one another. It is resolved when the audience of those debates in courts are addressed to a judge or a jury, and they make a decision. And we draw out the law in the common law tradition from the results of those debates, rather than, as some have tried to create in the civil law tradition, thinking of the law as a science, and the law is well engineered if it creates a mathematical grid and solving legal problems. This isn't the way it ever works, but this is sort of the ideal in the civil law system. Solving a legal problem requires you to know what this grid looks like and trace down column A and trace across column B and then find the answer to the legal problem. The common law tradition rejects it, and we reject it. In the manner of your legal instruction, when we ask you questions in class, when we make you talk on your feet, we're not doing something secondary to legal education. In the common law tradition, we're doing something of equal dignity with knowing the law. In fact, slightly more, because we think knowledge of the law in itself is not important until it can be activated. The final expression of law is in counseling people, in moving judges, in moving juries, in moving arbitration panels, that sort of thing. So I think it's an important subject for us as Christians to ask, is it appropriate to argue and persuade in this rhetorical manner? And last week I said, look, Paul gives us some pause because he rejects, he says, the wisdom of the world, the manner of the debaters of this age. He wants to differentiate what he does from the secular rhetorical traditions. And I wanted to begin with that because that's very important. When he speaks, he says, he came to the Corinthians, and all he knew was Christ and him crucified. He describes himself as untrained, unskilled in legal rhetoric, or in the rhetoric of the day. On the other hand, he says, I persuade people. I take captive arguments. I throw down everything that stands between people and Jesus Christ. He says, every day I was going to the synagogue and arguing and persuading the people. He says, it's precisely because I know Jesus Christ and am sent as his ambassador that I work so hard to persuade you. And the two questions that we have to address in this course is one, does Paul, in rejecting some forms of rhetoric, does he reject rhetoric? Is it something we shouldn't do? If it is, then that's bad, because that's what we're doing. So I hope that's not what he does. We'll have to change the law school curriculum. Dean Lee, make a note. We need to check on that. If it is something he does, if he does use topical arguments, if he comes at arguments from many directions, if he uses style, if he uses arrangement, if he's engaging with this aspect of things, then that's good. But we need to understand, this is the second question, whether it is good or not to argue and persuade through rhetoric is the first. The second one is, what is he doing that's distinctive? He says he's doing something different than the way the world does it, and we want to understand, what is that? And that's going to be the main work of this course, because I think, as we'll see today, it's plainly obvious that Paul is aware of the rhetorical dimensions of his situation and is using the same skills of topical argumentation. He's using the same skills of arrangement and style. He is aiming to persuade, not just to engage in some kind of scientific demonstration. So take today's letter. The basic theme of the book of Galatians is there are people in Galatia who are being urged to follow the law of Moses in order to be saved. They're being told, if you become a Christian and you're not a Jew, you have to take up the Jewish law and follow it. And in particular, the flashpoint of this is circumcision. You need to be circumcised. This is the great sign of the Old Testament covenant with the Jews. It was a mark on the flesh, and without that mark, you could not be a part of Israel. And so the Jews are saying that you must be circumcised. But just reflect for a second, just in the chapter you've read. Is this a scientific treatise on circumcision? Is this a scientific presentation of the ethical question, what is circumcision and who should be circumcised? I think it's obvious that it's not. I think it's obvious to the eye that Paul is engaged here in many, many, many kinds of argumentations. He has masterfully arranged the argument that he makes, and he's engaged in persuasion using perhaps an untrained but a very powerful kind of rhetoric. So just to help you see some of this, consider the following. If you were writing a scientific treatise on circumcision and whether it should be done or not, then Paul would say sometimes Christians can be circumcised. Why do I say that? Well, because Paul circumcised. We read in Acts 16 that when he went to Derbe and Lystra, there was a disciple there you may have heard of named Timothy. And Paul wanted to take him with him on his missionary trips. And so Paul circumcised him. Big deal. Notice he doesn't mention this fact when he's arguing to the Galatians. Galatians is a very powerful argument against circumcision as against the gospel. And he doesn't take time, which is what you would do if you were writing a scientific treatise on circumcision. If you were trying to comprehensively discuss all the truth about circumcision, to begin by saying, you and I both know that Christians can be circumcised. There are appropriate times for Christians to be circumcised. I myself have circumcised Christians. But there are also times when you should not be circumcised. Here are the times when you should not be circumcised. Here are the times when you should be circumcised. He doesn't do that. Another issue with the Galatians is following, Paul says, they're urging you to follow the special days, the months, the years, the calendar of Jewish life, to perform other ceremonies. And Paul does not stop to say, you know, it's okay for Christians in some circumstances to follow the ceremonies of the Jews. So a remarkable example of this is in Acts 21. Paul goes to Jerusalem, and the Jews there say, everybody's mad at you. They think you're requiring the Jews to give up circumcision and the observance of days. And so what we'd like you to do is we would like you to take these 4 men to the temple for the oath of the Nazirite and arrange for the shaving of their hair and arrange put in a calendar with the temple about when they'll come back and perform their purification rituals after their time as Nazirites. So Paul goes whole hog on this. He takes the 4 men, and he does it himself too. He goes to the temple, he shaves off his hair to mark a time of sanctifying yourself from certain things like drinking wine and touching the dead, and he does it himself. Does he mention that in this letter? Does he go, by the way, it's okay sometimes to observe days and weeks and months? He doesn't. He is not writing a balanced, comprehensive, rationalistic treatise on the nature of circumcision or the Jewish customs or everything that can be said about them. He's trying to move particular people with respect to a particular moment in their lives. There's a lot of talk about eating in this letter as well. Paul does not take time to say, it's okay for Christians to keep kosher, it's okay for Christians to abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. If you want to read about that, 1 Corinthians 8 and 9 has a long discussion, much closer to a scientific ethical treatise, about when it's appropriate to abstain from meat, when it's appropriate to follow dietary rules of the Jews in order not to weaken the conscience of a weaker brother, and when it is necessary for you not to do those things. But that is not what he's doing in this letter. There are people who have been attacked in their faith, who are being led away from the grace of Jesus Christ, whose consciences are under attack. Instead of having a stronghold of conscience in Jesus Christ, where you can say, not because of my works, but because of the blood of Jesus Christ, I stand before God righteous. And although the law points out my many sins, I tell my conscience to ignore the law and focus on Jesus Christ. He is witnessing people being attacked, and he focuses like a laser on persuading them not to enter down that course. Don't get circumcised. Don't observe days. Don't observe dietary laws. Why? Because I would say he's not engaged in writing a scientific treatise. He is doing what we do. He is persuading people. And so he is offering the arguments that are best suited to persuade them, and he is not engaged in a scientific discussion of all the issues about circumcision, observance of days, his own background, all of those things. He is persuading, and masterfully so. And remember, as I say, if you did try to write a scientific treatise about circumcision or when it's appropriate to observe the law and when it's not, that would be very difficult. When in Acts 15 we read, and this is an interesting question, when this happened, did it happen before what we read in Galatians 2 or after? But Paul was sent to Jerusalem And along with him came those people who were arguing what was being argued to the Galatians, and all the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem got together to decide the question, should Gentiles who become Christians, should non-Jews who become Christians, should they be circumcised? Do they need to obey the law of Moses? And the council, interestingly, did not say, forget about the law, ignore it. The council did not say, forget about all this stuff. They offered a very interesting judgment. This is what it reads, is Acts 15:9. The judgment, therefore, is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols, abstain from sexual immorality, abstain from the meat of strangled animals, and abstain from blood. And the reason they give, they say, because Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. I don't want to get into exactly what that means, but it's interesting that when the apostles, Paul and Peter and all the rest of the apostles met in Jerusalem to discuss these matters, they did not simply say, forget about the law. They didn't do that. They thought that there was a relevance to the law, it's a complicated relevance, but this is a complicated question. These are complicated issues. And Paul is not exploring all of them. Paul is persuading particular people, selecting his arguments, arranging them in a powerful way, using style of language that can be very strong. So just think about this for a second. I didn't ask you to read this today, but you can look at it for yourself in Acts 15. There was a very famous meeting in Jerusalem where the very issue that was being argued in Galatia, should Christians be circumcised or not, had been decided decisively against circumcision. They said, you must circumcise, and the council said, well, you got to do these other things, but not circumcision. And so a really interesting thing to think about was the second chapter of Galatians written before this council? It's not mentioned, so it's possible it wasn't mentioned because it hadn't happened yet. Was it written after the council? Which of those two things is it? So there's this famous council where they decided no circumcision. Paul does not mention it in the second chapter of Galatians or anywhere through Galatians. Why not? Either way, I think it adds strongly to our thesis that Paul is arguing rhetorically. First, just to think about this, if this confrontation that we read about with Peter happened before the Council of Jerusalem, it's really, really interesting because at the Council of Jerusalem, Peter is the lead speaker in favor of non-circumcision. If what we read in Galatians 2, where Paul and Peter have this confrontation about circumcision, if it happened before the council, then Peter was convinced. Peter was greatly moved, and he became a champion of Paul's position. In fact, Peter makes many of the same arguments in Acts 15 at the council that Paul makes in Galatians 2. If it happened, Galatians 2 happened first, then Peter was profoundly moved. But equally important, when you read Acts 15 and compare it with Galatians 2, you'll see that Paul argues about circumcision very differently at Jerusalem than he does with Peter, than he does in Galatians. In the Council of Jerusalem, Paul just gets up and he goes, the uncircumcised have been filled with the Holy Spirit. By the thousands, they are turning and proclaiming Jesus Christ, and they are celebrating God, moved by the Holy Spirit. That's it. And the room, we're told, goes silent. His description of the salvation of the Gentiles through the name of Jesus Christ, through faith in Jesus Christ, is so powerful that everybody goes quiet. He adopts a very, very, very different rhetorical strategy at the council than he does at in the argument with Peter. A very, very different approach. He's selecting his argument. He is looking at his audience, he's deciding what will persuade, and he's choosing his argumentation. Also, if Galatians 2 happened first, one of the things he doesn't do at the council is mention his confrontation with Peter. One of the things he could have done is he could have pointed to Peter, and he could have gone, I argued with Peter at Antioch, and boy, I came up with a real zinger of an argument and really put him in his place. Look at that guy. He's come over to my position. I have the authority of Peter on my side. I argued with him in public in Antioch, and I won. He does do that in Galatians 2. So if this is happening, if all of this is before the council, he really changes his style of argument by the time he gets to the council. He has a very, very different structure of argumentation in the two places. Why? Because in neither place is he simply saying all the truth that can be said about circumcision or the nature of the faith. He is persuading. He is thinking of the range of arguments, picking the best one, adopting the right style, arranging his arguments in the right way. Now, equally, if the argument with Peter happened after the council, that is to say, there was this big decision by all the apostles in Jerusalem that happened before the argument in Galatians 2, then also it shows an incredible rhetorical choice. There were a clear authority. I mean, imagine, in your context, the United States Supreme Court has just decided a case directly on point with yours. It came down 6 months ago. Everybody knows about it. It's right there, and it supports your case. And you decide not to use it in your legal brief. Professor Mundy would give you an F for that, but why might you decide not to do that? Well, maybe the case also decided at some point that raises questions about your case. Maybe there's something problematic about doing it. If the argument in Galatians 2 about circumcision happened after the decision in Jerusalem about circumcision, then Paul was there, Paul has chosen not to rely on that argument. He has chosen to ignore the authority of the other apostles, precisely because, as we'll see, he's preaching about Christ. One of his points is, the gospel is the gospel. The gospel comes from God. It doesn't come by the authority of men. It doesn't come through the arguments of men. It's established on its own terms. And so he may have very well decided, even though I could appeal to the authority of Peter and James and all of these others, in order for these Galatians to understand the nature of the gospel that I'm trying to turn them back to, they need to understand that it comes from God and not from men. So either way, in this argument in Galatians, it either happens before the council in Jerusalem, in which case we can see that he chooses his arguments carefully. Sometimes he argues about the same issue one way, sometimes he argues about it another way, even though the issue is exactly the same. His opponents are exactly the same. If it happens after, it teaches us other lessons. Again, he's choosing his arguments, he's arranging it in profound ways. So that is, it seems to me, if you had any doubts, which I think if you've read through Galatians 2, I don't know that you would, but it seems very clear to me that Paul is engaged in the same kinds of skills, art, technique that we are when we learn and study how to make arguments better. He is not approaching this question, should you circumcise or not, as an opportunity to write a systematic treatise on circumcision, or a systematic treatise on Christian ethics, or a systematic theology, all of which are good, by the way, There's nothing wrong with them. They're very good. It's just not what he's doing. And happily for us, what he's doing is very much like what we do in the law. And so I think we can take some comfort from that. We can recognize that we're engaged in the same kind of basic activity. So let's get into the argument between Paul and Peter that we have today. As I said, the occasion of this is the Galatians have been approached by false teachers, people who are eager to make themselves look good and to avoid persecution from the Jews by getting those non-Jews who convert to Christianity to adopt the Jewish law, particularly circumcision. And Paul has a great theme. And this second chapter of Galatians is one of the clearest presentations of the principle of justification, which is so important to the gospel and the church. Galatians 2:15, basic point theme of the book. We know a man is not justified. He doesn't stand righteous before God by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. If you want to understand how to make yourself right with God, everybody naturally thinks you make yourself right with God, by doing what he wants, by observing the works of the law, by doing the things that God commands. And Paul says, no one is justified that way. No one can obey the law. This is part of our sinful nature and constitution. We become right with God. We are justified by putting our faith in God. But how can we do that? We stand before God as sinners. How can we trust in God when we know that we have betrayed him, when we know that we have betrayed other people, when we know that we deserve judgment? And the answer is, God died for you to reconcile himself to you. He sent his Son, who gave his blood, which covers your sins, and you should attack, ignore, throw away any part of your conscience that says, I am judged by the law. You stand before God justified as you put your trust in Jesus Christ. Amen?
Amen.
He could just say that and stop. But he doesn't. The lead into the letter is calling out these false teachers, characterizing them, and damning them. Paul says in the first chapter, evidently some people are throwing you into confusion, and they're trying to pervert the gospel. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preached, let him be eternally condemned. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let him be eternally condemned. That is to say, judged by God for damnation in hell. Now, this is not scientific language. What he's doing here is, without saying, look, Galatians, if you abandon Jesus Christ, you have abandoned your hope of salvation, you're going to hell. He is slightly pulling back from that by saying, hypothetically, if someone were to do this horrible thing, let them be damned to hell. But he's still using very strong language. Let him be condemned eternally. Why is he using this strong language? He wants them to pay attention. What we're talking about here matters for eternity. If you join in this teaching, I want you to be condemned eternally because you're attacking the gospel of Jesus Christ. Is that an acceptable way of making an introduction? It absolutely is. When we introduce topics, we want people to understand the importance of what we're doing so that they pay attention. If it's important to them, they should pay attention. And so lawyers and evangelists oftentimes use strong language to raise people's attention to the stakes. Paul doesn't use the strongest language he could. He could be even stronger. He could have said, you Galatians should all go to hell if you're doing these things. You will all go to hell if you're doing these things. He could have said that. It's true, but he pulls it back, not all the way back. He pulls it back just a notch. Why? Because he's trying to persuade them. You can persuade people better sometimes by pulling it back a notch than by saying every hard truth that there is. You're all going to hell. It's a bad start. Sometimes. In our reading for today, Paul is doing something which seems very tangential to his ultimate argument that you should not be circumcised because you are justified by faith and not by works of the law. In the first chapter and then through all the way through the second chapter when we pick up, he says, I want you to know that the gospel I preached to you did not come from men, it came from God. And he lays out the story of his life. He lays out the story of his life. I was a Jew. I was a great Jew. I was a super Jew. I was doing everything right as a Jew. I was persecuting the Christians. And I had a dramatic conversion, and Jesus Christ spoke to me himself. That's where I got the gospel from. And after I became a Christian and learned the gospel from Jesus Christ, I did not go talk to any other Christians. I did not go to Jerusalem. I did not talk to the apostles. I went right off and started converting people. And it wasn't for many years until I first went back to Jerusalem. And in our reading today, he continues this, and this is all introductory material. He's explaining the credibility of the gospel that he presented. He's building up the source and strength of the arguments. This comes directly from God. It's not about men, because the people who were attacking were saying, oh, over in Jerusalem, this is what they're teaching. And Paul is saying, don't worry about what the men say, worry about the gospel. You got it true from me. I got it straight from God. I gave it to you. An introduction should not argue, properly speaking. It should engage the attention of people. It should map out some of the issues, which Paul does very carefully, as we'll see. But it may insinuate some of the arguments. That is to say, it may anticipate them. It may gesture at them. And Paul, in telling his story, takes yet another detour from the story he's telling about how he didn't rely on the gospel from Jerusalem to mention, hey, by the way, when I finally did go to Jerusalem, I had a Greek with me, and nobody required him to be circumcised. I was there in Jerusalem with my buddy Titus, and he was not required to be circumcised. He's not arguing it yet, just a little hip check, a little bump along the way that starts leading the mind in the right direction. Was it wrong to mention that? I mean, formally what he's doing is explaining that the gospel did not come to him from Jerusalem. Was it wrong to do that? Should he have stuck to the topic he was on at that point? He's announced, I'm going to tell you about the gospel, where it came from. It came from God, not from Jerusalem. But along the way, he just happens to mention this. No, it's brilliant rhetoric. It's exactly what you should do. It's a brief aside. It doesn't distract from the main point he's making, but it anticipates the main issue that he's going to address. So he relates how he was approved in Jerusalem on his first visit. Notice he's saying, well, they agreed with it, but they didn't give it to me. And then he relates an incident after Jerusalem. He goes to Antioch, and when he's in Antioch, he's there with Peter. Peter's being great. Peter is eating with the Gentiles. Peter and Paul are one in their ministry. And then people come from Jerusalem, and they start saying that Gentiles should be circumcised, they should obey the dietary laws, and that the Jews should not be eating, the Jewish Christians should not be eating with the Gentiles. And here's a statement at Galatians 2:11 of what we read. When Peter came to Antioch and did this, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, their pretense. Hypocrisy just means pretending. The Greek word there is hypocrisy. It's the same word. We just use it in English. The other Jews joined him in this pretending and this acting so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas, Paul's big buddy, his missionary companion, was led astray. And when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile. How is it then that you force Gentiles to live like Jews?" Wow, great argument, right? This is brilliant, snappy, powerful argument. He's there in front of everybody with Peter, and he confronts him in public with this zinger of an argument. It's balanced. It has a beautiful stylistic form. It's a little elliptical. That is to say, it leaves out some of the logical structure, but it creates a very clear contradiction. You're a Jew. You live like a Gentile. How can you make Gentiles live like Jews? You see? It's stylistically nice. It's stylistically nice. It's balanced. It's pithy. It contains in a grammatical form the entire contradiction of Peter's position. How do you think he said this to Peter? I can imagine a rough way you could say this to Peter and a gentle way you could say it to Peter. You could see Peter, and in front of everybody you could go, "You're a Jew, but you live like a Gentile. Why are you making the Gentiles live like Jews?" I could see the argument that way. Or I could see him saying something more like this. He sees his brother Peter. He knows that Peter had a revelation from God to go to the Gentiles. He was told to go to the centurion's house and eat with them and to be with them, that he brought about great conversions of the Gentiles. Maybe it's after the Jerusalem Council, maybe not, but maybe it is, and he's heard Peter speak eloquently on this subject. And he sees his brother afraid. He sees his brother afraid of the circumcision party. That's what it says. He's afraid of them. And he wants to encourage him. And he says something more like, "You're a Jew, but you live like a Gentile. You've experienced the Word of God, that everything that God touches is clean. Everything that comes from God is clean, and you have been living like a Gentile through the power of the gospel. You've been freed from the law. How can you, my brother, how can you make Gentiles live like Jews?" There's a passage that's coming up in Galatians 6 where he says, when you find your brother in spiritual error, restore him gently. Because you want to watch out for the temptation that in your roughness, you fall yourself. Now, I'll point out, when he's talking to the false teachers, when he's not correcting his brother, he is clearly very rough. One point in this gospel, he says, "I wish that those guys, those false teachers, who I've already said should be eternally damned to hell, I wish that since they're so interested in chopping off male parts, they would go ahead and cut themselves completely off." He uses even more direct language than I'm using. He can be very, very, very strong. But on the whole, I think he probably addressed Peter as a brother, and he corrected him gently. One reason I think that is, if he had addressed him roughly, if he had awoken the spirit of argumentation in Peter, if he had summoned out a strong argumentative response, there's a lot that Peter could say. Although the argument, you're a Jew, you live like a Gentile, why should the Gentiles live like Jews? There's a lot that Peter could say in response. And one of the things I hope you learned this year, lawyers, we learned there are 4 ways to contradict any argument. If somebody argues against me, I have 4 things I can respond on. I can deny they get the facts right. I can deny that they've defined their terms correctly. I can admit they've defined their terms correctly, but say they've misunderstood the quality. It's not always the same quality. Sometimes it varies. Or I can argue about the jurisdiction. And Peter could have made all those arguments. He could have said, I'm not living like a Jew. I'm living like exactly what I am, an evangelist. And as you observe in this Galatians 2, I'm specially tasked with evangelizing Jews. So of course, I'm not trying to offend these Jews who I'm trying to convert. Of course, I am trying to lead the Jewish party. Of course, I'm spending more time with them. You're called to the Gentiles, Paul. Why don't you go over there? You say, I'm a Jew who lives like a Gentile. That's factually wrong. I'm merely eating only with the Jews. You say, I compel them. I didn't tell anybody what to do. I didn't tell the Gentiles to be circumcised. Or he could have said, you've got your definitions wrong. You yourself say, I'm guilty of hypocrisy. But you've accused me of compelling the Gentiles. You're right about the facts. I am acting out of fear. But you've charged me with the wrong thing. If I'm acting out of fear, then I'm not intending to compel the Gentiles. You've defined the terms wrong. Or you could say, yeah, you're right about everything, but in this missionary situation, this is the right thing to do. You, Paul, sometimes circumcise people. You, Paul, sometimes observe dates and things. You sometimes give in to the weakness of your audience. That's what I'm doing. It's good. Or he could say, why are you confronting me in public? What is this about? You and I have known each other for years. You know my authority. You know all these things. How dare you confront me in public? Now, I don't know. Maybe Peter did argue with him. But Paul doesn't mention any of that. And my own belief is that this happened before the council in Jerusalem, and that these words and what followed were not meant to argue Peter into a logical contradiction, to invite him to argument, but were part of a gentle correction of a brother. Powerful, it has logic behind it. Emotional. I think that's the better way to read this passage. But I could be wrong. It could be, it's a public event. It's certainly a confrontation. Maybe he was treating him pretty roughly. I don't know. You should make your own mind up about what he did. What follows then is an elaboration of this argument where Paul draws this out and tries to show the tension between following the works of the law and the gospel of Jesus Christ. But again, it's a very, very complicated issue. Paul himself circumcises. Paul himself observes Jewish law sometimes. He observes dietary rules sometimes. This is a very complicated issue. The true argument here is not in the strict logic of the thing alone. I still remember the first time that I read Luther's commentary on Galatians, which I think the greatest commentary in my life is Luther's commentary on the 2nd chapter of Galatians. It's on the internet. Go look it up. Go read it if you want to read some Luther. It is more in the placing of the power of the gospel next to everything else in its worthlessness and its powerlessness that moves Peter, I believe, in this argument as it moved me. My experience of reading this and my deepening of a sense that, hey, Like these Galatians, like these Jews, sometimes you lose track of the power of Jesus Christ to save you in your life. You lose track of that centrality. In other words, a big question we have to ask, remembering what what Paul said in 1 Corinthians, is he says that when he preaches, all he knows is Jesus Christ. He doesn't just say Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. That's not what he says. There are ways of leading people rhetorically to Jesus Christ that don't just involve saying the words Jesus Christ. And the opening move that he makes with Peter here, I think, is a part of that structure. It begins a chain which leads to Jesus Christ. You're a Jew, but you don't live like a Jew, because we Jews know sin better than anybody. We have died to the law through the law. The law has so completely convicted us of sin that we were desperate for a Savior, and we found him in Jesus Christ, so we don't live by the law anymore. We can't rebuild the law in our life, because that would be to rebuild what was destroyed. And that would make us bigger transgressors than any kind of violation of the law that would be, to know Jesus Christ, to know the power of his salvation, and then to throw it all away for rituals, to throw it all away for days and years and dietary rules, to throw it away for pride that we got somebody else to circumcise themselves, to throw it away for fear, Peter. So, here's my overall conclusion for the day. Does Paul argue scientifically, like a Platonist, like a mathematician? Does he address a crisis about circumcision by writing a scientific ethical treatise? No, obviously not. It's not a scientific ethical treatise. He makes all sorts of interesting rhetorical choices. He argues differently on the same issue against the same opponents in Acts 15 and Galatians 2. He uses style. He comes up with this pithy, you're a Jew, you act like a Gentile, why do you make the Gentiles act like the Jew? It's great. It could be like an advertisement. I love it. It's great. Punch. Wonderful. He argues rhetorically. What we now need to push through as we continue to observe that he does argue rhetorically is, how is he doing it differently? What sense can we make when we read something like Galatians 2, where he's building up his ethos, he's telling his life story, where he's drawing principles into contention with Peter? In what sense is he only knowing Jesus Christ? In a basic way today is we can say, look, everything he's doing is drawing people towards Jesus Christ. He doesn't just say the words Jesus Christ, but everything he does draws people to Jesus Christ. And this is a great challenge for you. This is why we have Christianity in Law class, because in whatever legal work you're doing, whatever counsel you're giving, whatever arguments you're making before a judge, if you want to argue as a Christian, you need to know how what you're doing and saying can draw people to Jesus Christ. And it can happen in two ways, I think. I mean, one, the operation of the law is a pedagogue that prepares people for Jesus Christ. When people understand that their behavior is measured by man and by God, they develop shame, they develop a sense of sin, and that prepares them for Jesus Christ. And secondly, sometimes in the course of counseling people and in the interrelations we have when we're with lawyers, you have a chance directly to bring it all the way home. I've had clients crying in my arms, and their problem, that they weren't crying because my arguments were bad. I guarantee you, my arguments were good. That's not why they were crying. They were crying because of their frustration with the law, because of their sense of shame as their actions were exposed. And at those moments, we are prepared to lead all that we do into Jesus Christ. So as you read through these passages, check. Is Paul arguing rhetorically? And ask yourself the question that we'll be developing throughout the rest of this semester. How does he argue specifically in a distinctive way? How does he know only Jesus Christ when he's talking about so many different matters? Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, give us wisdom of the mouth, give us wisdom of speech, so that everything we do and say, we might know Jesus Christ and rely on him. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.